Hi. This is my little intro to Ghost for you. This isn't a movie that I'll be surprised if you find it difficult to get into. It's pretty contemporary, and I'll be surprised if anything strikes you as sort of weird or alienating in its basic format. It's not. Again, this is one of those movies where we don't have to do a lot of cultural travel. We're not moving back into the old days. It's a little bit old days. You'll see that the computers look old. I think of it as very much as an '80s movie. And you guys, most of you don't remember the '80s, but it was the Reagan era. And I guess the reason I say an '80s movie, the major characters in this movie are what they used to call yuppies. I don't know if that's a word people still use or not, but it was a big word in the '80s and maybe in the '70s, but especially in the '80s. Yuppies stood for young urban professionals. And it was sort of a sardonic variation on hippies. Or there was also a group called the Yippies in the '60s who were anti-war protesters. And so yuppies, no, they weren't political, boy. They're not protesting nothing. They're young urban professionals. And they sort of, that even the coining of that word sort of represented this shift out of the world of the '60s to the world that came after. And the Reagan years, especially, were a big reaction against the '60s. The counterculture was getting shoved away, and the country was moving from a fair amount of left-wing radicalism to conservatism, which was symbolized by Ronald Reagan. So the major characters in this movie, they have all these yuppie hallmarks. They live in a big city. They're on the island of Manhattan. The two major male characters work on Wall Street. They're doing something stockbrokery. They got a fancy apartment down, and it looks like Soho. Where yuppies were moving into that area in New York that was once a factory district, and they're turning it all into fancy apartments and stuff like that. So it's all very kind of its time and of a certain socioeconomic group, young urban professionals who don't have children. Okay? These people, when they got kids, they'd probably move out to the suburbs. But for now, they're young and they're in New York and they're enjoying the attractions of Manhattan. So in that sense, it's an '80s movie. But also because it's New York, even if they're privileged, they're also not far away from people who aren't at all privileged. Okay, and so the socioeconomics of it is interesting. This movie and the one we'll do next, The Sixth Sense, the reason I paired them is because they're both what you might call a supernatural thriller. The plot is thriller-like, especially in this one, more conventionally so. Sixth Sense, it's a little complicated. It feels like a thriller, but exactly what the plot arc is a little more complicated. This one, it was a huge hit. This movie killed at the box office. It only won, I think, one Oscar. Whoopi Goldberg won for Best Supporting Actress, and I think you'll see why. It's a great role, and she's perfect for it. You'll see. But otherwise, this wasn't the sort of movie that won Oscars, but it did do huge box office, and it has lasted. It has, I don't think it has worn out. People still watch this one, and so you might ask yourself, and Sixth Sense also didn't win. It was nominated for Best Picture, but it didn't win. You might ask yourself, why wouldn't these movies win Oscars? But both were extremely successful at the box office, and both have worn well. Both, are still cool to watch. So keep that you can keep that question in the back of your mind. These are the sorts of movies, when I say supernatural, if you buy into one supernatural aspect in their premise, The rest is all supposed to feel realistic. It's in that sense, it's a what if movie. It's like you take one thing and you change it from most of our daily experiences. You bring in something that's supernatural. And then you try to play out how everything would go if this particular truth were true. If this particular premise were true, were factual. And in this case, since the premise has to do with life after death, first of all, some people do believe in ghosts anyway. Some of you probably do. But also, none of us know, right? There's no way to establish what the scientific facts are about the afterlife. So it presents a vision of the afterlife. And part of the interest of the movie is sort of us thinking through, what if it's like this? And what does it mean if it's like this? Okay. It presents a theory of what can happen after death. And we're all pretty interested. We'd all like to know what happens after death. So that's part of the interest of the movie. There's also a crime to be solved. That's part of the interest of the movie. And probably the biggest thing, there's what does death do to love? There is a deeply loving relationship at the center of the movie. And how does death affect each member of that relationship? And I think that's what gives the movie a real kind of emotional resonance. Because, yeah, we all want to know about death, but we also have almost, at some point, everybody loses someone they love. Someone they love will die. Some of you have already experienced that. All of us, pretty much, unless we die very young. If we live any length of time on the earth, we lose somebody we love. And it's one of the biggest things that happens to a person. And so we all plugged in. When I saw this movie in the movie theater in Philadelphia, it was in a kind of rough part of Philadelphia. And a lot of people in that movie theater, mostly people look normal, but some of them look pretty rough, pretty kind of tough. Kind of like you avoided eye contact with them. But I remember sitting there at the end of that movie, at the end of Ghost, and I was kind of hit hard. How there's some movies you don't leave soon? You sort of sit there while the credits roll because you're kind of gathering yourself back. That's how I was at the end of the movie. So I was sitting there, and I was towards the back of the theater, and so a lot of people kind of were streaming up the aisles past me as they left at the end of the movie. And almost every face that passed me had tears running down. Almost all of them. And a lot of them looked like people who you didn't see cry very often. But the way I took it was that everybody in there had lost somebody. Everybody in there had wishes about what could happen, what might happen, what they would like to see happen. We all have somebody we'd like to see again. We all have somebody we hope we maybe, if we're lucky, we'll get to see again. But we can't see them now. And this movie, I think, taps into that vein of emotion. You'll see. I don't want to give away anything, so I'm not going to say anything more about that. But see how you feel at the end of this movie. Because that's how I felt, and that's how the people in the movie theater seemed to pass as I watched their faces as they walked past me. Okay. I think that's enough. You can watch this one. I hope you like it.